So today I will be talking about legal and policy trends towards light pollution mitigation. Before I will dig into regulatory framework and talking about law and policy, I would like to have a brief introduction about what is light pollution, what is the definition, what are the recognized form of light pollution, what are the light pollution sources, and why we actually should care about it. So why what are the impacts of light pollution? Then I will go to formation of the regulatory framework by addressing what are the triggers of light pollution regulations, and then I will present you my classification of legal and policy acts because light pollution is a very broad field and it's very difficult to find where these requirements are, where the lighting norms are, and where we are all going. Then I will give you some specific example. I think this is the most exciting part for everybody to see how this classification work. I hope it will help you to dig into this subject within your national legislation. And then I will provide you with some conclusions and recommendations. And then I will be welcoming your questions. So to start with, let's talk about light pollution in general. Something went wrong. Just my presentation. What should I click? Here. Okay, I found myself. Let's talk about light pollution. I would like to start from the definition. Yesterday, I actually had a very interesting discussion with one of my colleagues, and he indicated that there is actually no commonly accepted definition of light pollution. And this creates gigantic problems for development of the legislation, for addressing the problem, and for quantifying light pollution in general. Because we know what it is, especially if you're in the field, but how do we explain it to general public? Or how do we adopt the legislation which will work without having any implementation problems? So there is ongoing initiatives on defining what is light pollution. And also without the definition of light pollution, we support the argument that light pollution is not a problem. So I would like to maybe after my talk discuss how would you define light pollution because it will really help us to make the terminology. So here you see the easiest, in my opinion, and the definition which reflects different and broad aspects of light pollution. So I prefer this definition. Light pollution is an environmental problem which is caused by increased, unwanted, and misdirect artificial light at night. What are the forms of light pollution? Light pollution, like there are four main recognized forms of light pollution. First is light clutter, which is bright and excessive groupings of light sources. You mainly can see them if you cross the roads. At the crossroads, you see the lighting installations on every road. This is the light clutter, basically. Then the next form of light pollution is sky glow. It's a brightening of the night sky over inhabited areas, or maybe not always inhabited areas, unfortunately, because light is a transboundary concern, so it spreads further than inhabited areas. Sky glow is visible everywhere, basically nowadays, and it creates the most problems for the environment and for astronomical activities. The next form of light pollution is light trespass. It's when light falling where it's not intended or not needed. The example can be when you have a lighting pole next to your house, like the street lighting, which actually leads directly to your window. This is the case everywhere, like for example in Brussels. I had a friend who was living in Brussels and there was a literally lighting pole with gigantic amount of illumination just lighting his room, which is very bad for our health, but I will go to it later. And the last form, but not the least important, is glare and excessive brightness, which causes visual discomfort. When we talk about glare, it's actually very dangerous when we talk about road safety. When it takes 20 minutes for our eye to adjust from very lit environment to a dark environment. So it takes for us some time to adjust and to see at night, let's put it that way. And if we are driving on a very lit road, it will be very difficult for us to see pedestrians or cyclists which will come from the darkness. And this glare, which is created by very illuminated roads, which is the very big case in the European Union, can create even mortality cases. So, what are the sources of light pollution? There are three main sources of light pollution, in my opinion, but there is no distinct opinion. Some researchers, for example, don't include indoor illumination. So the first and the most obvious source of light pollution is outdoor lighting installations. So here we talk about floodlights, street lighting, advertising, security lights, sport lighting. So everything what you can see outside, which reminds me of a lighting installation, right? Then I consider, as well as some other researchers, that indoor illumination also contribute to light pollution levels. Here you see the picture of New York, and I think it's pretty clearly shows that skyscrapers actually significantly increase nighttime brightness. Like, I think it's pretty clear. And you can also see the reflection of the lighting from them in the surface of water. And I will talk about it later about the environmental impact. It's very bad for marine environment as well. And the last and a pretty new form of source of light pollution is actually satellites and mega constellations of satellites. During the past years, we have seen a lot of satellites being sent on the different Earth orbits, which create significant problems, obviously, for astronomical observations, astronomical activities, but also for the environment. Recently, I think around a month ago, Kevin Gaston published with some co-authors, he published a research on how actually satellites impact the environment as well. Because most of the species, they orientate themselves according to celestial objects and the stars. And now we have additional moving objects in our dark sky, which disturbs the navigation and migratory routes of various species. So it's a bigger problem than astronomy, as we think about it. So why we actually have to care about light pollution? Like I already made a brief introduction of the impacts, but now I would like to go more deeply into this. So light pollution has very broad impacts. This is why it's very difficult to regulate it because we don't know where specifically to put it. There are some obvious impacts, which is disappearance of the dark skies, and we touch here the cultural aspects, the connectivity with the dark skies, the romantic nights. Do you remember when the last time you had a really nice walk in the evening when you've seen the stars? I mean, I did. I just recently came from La Palma, but this is just a general exception. The most significant impacts from light pollution are faced actually by the environment, biodiversity, habitats. Here, I will also elaborate later on climate change and energy efficiency, because every time when we are talking about the use of artificial illumination, we are talking about the use of the energy. So the connection is pretty clear, in my opinion. Then we can talk also about significant impact on human health. Nowadays, we're constantly surrounded by lighting and LEDs. I'm not even talking about our phones or computers or television. I'm here talking more about artificial illumination from outside and inside, and it will significantly disturb our circadian rhythms. Again, I will elaborate a bit later. Then, among impacts, we can consider public and road safety. We have a very wrong perception, wrong perception from the perspective of dark sky protection person, that lighting is something very desirable and it really help us with the public safety. It's not entirely true, and I will try to elaborate on it later. And I will be very open for the discussion on this regard as well. When we talk about light pollution, we can also talk about violation of human rights. Try to have a look if you live in Europe somewhere. If you look at the, like, let's say, rich neighborhoods where like rich people live, they will have a proper lighting installations and decreased amount of illumination. And then if you see developing neighborhoods, they will be increased, like they will have increased amount of artificial light at night. And similar goes if we talk about developed countries and developing countries. Developing countries will have more artificial light at night generally. Then we talk obviously about astronomy and space exploration. As I mentioned earlier, we have new problem, which is orbital light pollution. And together with ground-based light pollution, we soon will not be able to do any astronomical activities, which is very sad because we decreasing the opportunity to explore outer space and maybe find something interesting for us. And the last but not the least important, in my opinion, is generally outdoor aesthetics. I think just light pollution is simply ugly, but you can argue about it also. So here you can see disappearance of the dark sky. On the left, the picture is obviously photoshopped, but you can basically see that we can we could possibly see the Milky Way in the city if we just reduced artificial illumination. The picture on the right side, I don't know if you can see my mouse, I'm not sure, but on the right side, this is basically what we face every single day, and it's actually really sad because dark sky has been inspiring gener- different generations to draw or to write some poetry. So cultural aspects of the dark skies are also important in my opinion. And by creating and by increasing artificial illumination, we actually decreasing the possibility to create something nice with regard to outer space. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, the most significant impacts of light pollution are faced by the environment. And here I'm talking about environment as a whole. I'm also talking about different species, and I'm talking about habitats and ecosystems in general as well. I would like to give you some example, which I would like you to remember. Uh, 70% of species living on Earth are actually nocturnal. And here on the right side, you can see sea turtles. And sea turtles, they lay their eggs on the shore at night, and then they locate themselves back to the sea by the light of the celestial objects or by the moonlight, for example. And then when the newborn sea turtles are hatched, they also want to urinate themselves by the light, right? However, most of the shore sites, they're extremely illuminated. And then these little sea turtles go on the roads, especially where the car are it's very dangerous. And here you can see basically how the little sea turtle facing the car. So you can understand the consequences. On the left side, you see the picture of habitats or ecosystem. I will give you an example of Europe. In Europe, we have Natura 2000 areas. Natura 2000 has been created by Habitats and the Birds Directive to provide the legal regime, protection, environmental protection regime, to allow species to migrate freely between different natural areas which are located in the different countries within the European Union and beyond. However, a lot of natural areas are divided by a gigantic road, and this road is highly illuminated. And research actually shows that species are trapped in the certain natural areas and they cannot migrate because of this artificial illumination. So this is a good example how lighting just basically violate even the strong legal regime of Natura 2000. Then, as I mentioned earlier, I would like to highlight climate change and energy efficiency aspects of lighting. This is pretty old data from 2021, but it shows pretty big numbers how much we can reduce in energy and CO2 emissions if we reduce light pollution. Recent research shows that we can reduce even more CO2 emissions by decreasing the amount of illumination. And I'm not even talking about the energy. There was also, it's interesting to keep in mind that people have very wrong perception of light. Like, we don't know what is the right amount of light. And there were a lot of research been done in northern European countries, and they reduced illumination by 80% in the city center of the big cities. People even didn't notice the difference. So this shows the subjective perception of lighting, not understanding how much lighting is good enough, and also how much energy we can actually save by simply reducing 80% of lighting, right? The next impact, which I already mentioned before, are impacts of artificial light at night on human health. Basically, because we constantly exposed to blue and white LEDs, this actually has a significant impact on our circadian rhythms. And the violation of circadian rhythms can lead to physical and mental diseases, including diabetes, hormone dependent cancers, or mental diseases such as depression or mood changing. And a lot of research has confirmed it. This is one of my favorite examples because now I would like to talk about public safety. So, when we talk about lighting and the public safety, we have to keep in mind two different things. There is the crime rates, which is an objective quantitative data, and we also have subjective perception of lighting, which is called fear of crime. And we shouldn't mix these two things together because when we talk about crime rates, because we have this perception that the more lighting we have, the safer it is. And it's actually wrong. There's a lot of research going on from the 1950s when the first lighting installations started to being introduced in our streets. Now we got to increase light pollution, obviously. But the research basically indicates, especially the recent one, that the amount of lighting doesn't necessarily correlate with crime rates, or on the other hand, it can even increase the crime rate. Another thing is fear of crime. I would like to mention something very interesting what is going on here in Belgium with the energy crisis. In the city of Ghent has turned off some lights in some random streets without explaining to the inhabitants of the city why this measure was introduced, except the energy efficiency. And then people started to write petitions that they are scared. So we shouldn't advocate also for the complete switch off of the lighting. It's about the right direction of the light. And here on the picture, you can see very precisely the difference of the good and the bad lighting. On top, it's obviously very bad lighting. Like the lighting is there, but it's actually blinds you, so you cannot see, and you probably will feel less safe. And on the picture below, you reduce light pollution by shielding, right, which contributes for the protection of the environment, but also you can see much more. So I really like this example and credits for the picture actually. The next important point is road safety. I mentioned earlier about how long it takes for us to adjust from very lit area to the very dark area. It's around 20 minutes. And can you imagine on this road having pedestrian or cyclist just crossing your road? You will just not be able to see it because you go from the very illuminated area to the dark area, which can create also a lot of collisions and not very pleasant situations. So here the picture of, in my opinion, like it's pretty ugly. I mean, it represents the urban development, but would you not mind to have dark skies above your city? I think everybody should start thinking about it. And then the last impact I want to discuss is impacts on astronomical observation. On the left, you can see the picture from one of the biggest telescopes on the world, which basically shows you that we cannot, like all these little dots, it can be galaxies or planets, so we cannot do any research because of this traces of the satellites, right? And then on the picture of the left, you can see how many satellites and space debris is there. Space debris is non-active space assets. So satellites, we have a certain guidance and management, and space debris also there. And it's a gigantic problem. It's a very unregulated area, and we have to think of protection not only Earth but outer space environment. Otherwise, we're just putting too much impact on further than our Earth, and we don't know where it's going to lead. And space debris and the satellites, they create additional light pollution, which is represented on the picture on the left. So this was a brief, very, very brief introduction of all the broad impacts of light pollution. And obviously, the research results, they didn't go unnoticed. And within my work, I have identified some triggers which have led to adoption of light pollution regulations. I have identified three main triggers. First of all, it's energy efficiency. It started to be very visible from October 2022 when the energy crisis hit on us, especially in Europe. More than 600 local governments in Europe and across the globe, more than 2,000 local governments started to impose measures to reduce artificial light at night, from complete switch off to curfews. But again, as I mentioned earlier with the example of Ghent, this measure is not sufficient enough in addressing light pollution. It should be obviously part of it because we have to talk about energy efficiency, we have to reduce energy, but we also have to think about other impacts which are related to light pollution. And also we have to provide a proper communication with the citizens so people don't freak out and started to write complaints to return the lighting. It's about the proper amount, the good direction, the best colors, rather than complete switch off. Again, it's my subjective opinion. The second trigger, which I find very important, is environmental concerns. Environmental research provided a lot of evidence on significant impact of artificial light at night on the environment and biodiversity, which I mentioned earlier, and a lot of international frameworks and national governments, they started to amend or adopt new legislation to address light pollution and these environmental impacts on the environment and human health. I will show some examples later. And the third trigger, which is very important, is astronomy and space sustainability. Obviously, astronomers were the first one who noticed light pollution again back in the 1950s. Due to their work from 1950s, we see the developments and adoption of the regulations, and now we have this new problem of also orbital light pollution. And we can see the policy and regulatory development in this regard. We cannot talk yet about the binding regulations, but we can see the discussion, ongoing discussions, and policy volunteer instruments like recommendations, which are aiming to reduce light pollution, both ground-based light pollution and orbital light pollution for astronomical activities, for the future space exploration, and obviously peaceful use of outer space. So now I would like to introduce my classification. I would like you to find yourself in this broad regulatory framework of light pollution mitigation, which is actually not really identified. So the first category of instruments which we can identify, all the instruments can be divided on legal and policy instruments. Legal and policy instruments, they're interconnected and interdependent. However, they have also significant difference. When we talk about the legal instruments, we are talking about the establishing binding regulations, for example, obligation to reduce artificial light at night levels. These obligations are established in a national or international legislation, for example, national Slovenian, Italian, French laws. When we talk about policy instruments, we're here talking about indicating the need to reduce artificial light levels. And we just give a direction and framework for the future action. So there is no actually enforcement part. We can say that we will reduce, but whether it will happen or not, we don't know. Similar is happening with climate change and this all the policy decisions. We never achieve the targets. So I'm advocating to have more legal instruments in this regard. The second category is hard and soft instruments. Talking about hard instruments or binding instruments, these instruments impose obligatory measures to reduce artificial light at night, and they're adopted by empowered international or state bodies. When we talk about non-binding or soft instruments, we're talking about recommendations or guidelines when some measures are recommended to reduce artificial light at night. So we're again not talking about enforcement part. And non-binding or soft instruments can be adopted by various actors, including NGOs or professional organizations, but also by international and state bodies as well. The next category is levels. So at which levels we can find regulations on light pollution mitigation. There are several levels we can talk about. There's an international level when we talk about that light pollution is understood as transboundary concern, and the international cooperation is there or required to address this issue. I will give you some examples of United Nations Environmental Programme action in this regard. So here we can talk about the global action. And then we have European Union level, obviously only for European member states, when light pollution also considered as transboundary concern and requires the cooperation between member states. But I will also talk about the European Union framework later. Then we have national and the local level. Here, like local is a part of the national level. When light pollution is considered as a national concern and the action is taken, whether and a national level or the local level. So when we can see, for example, national standards on light pollution mitigation, or you have a local lighting ordinance, which consists of several measures towards reduction of artificial illumination. But again, I will give you some specific examples, and I hope that it will be more clear. Then the part of my research which I'm actually really proud of, and this broad again regulatory frameworks, is very difficult to see directly where these norms are, but also when we thinking about creation light pollution requirements for mitigation, obviously, where we can put them. And within my research, I have identified several fields of regulations, fields of law and policy, where we can find light pollution norms. I'm writing an article, I hope it will be published by the end of this year, where I will present this classification, and I hope it will help the dark sky protection community and people who are interested in it to find the needed norms. So the first category where we can find these regulations is energy efficiency. When lighting norms, lighting measures are aiming to reduction of the amount of light to save the energy. But again, I want to highlight it again that focusing only on energy efficiency is not enough. We have to address more impacts. The next category or the next field or area of regulation is urban planning. In the urban planning documents, the amount of light is indicated per urban zone like residential or commercial or etc. The problem with urban planning is that it's indicated minimum amount of illumination, but doesn't in most cases indicate the maximum amount of light. And then we have the problem that the local governments has to face the minimum amount of street lighting, but they can go all over the place because there is no maximum limits. Then we have environmental protection when light pollution is considered as environmental pollution or artificial light is considered as pollutant, and we apply general environmental framework to address this issue, for example, environmental impact assessment. Then some countries have, or actually also in the international level, you have protection of astronomy and observations when dark zones to protect astronomical observations are created. I will give you some small, a little example of local law. The law of St. Petersburg to protect one of the observatories in St. Petersburg. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name. But my point is that there is an observatory which is actually uh, protected under UNESCO convention as well. And St. Petersburg adopted the specific law to create this dark sky zone across this observatory. But we have to keep in mind St. Petersburg is a pretty big city. This observatory is in the city. So it's a very big problem to keep this zone dark due to transboundary character of light pollution. But that law is interesting from the perspective that when urban development is in place next to the observatory, the government should consult with observatory whether this development is possible, and they have to indicate how light should be directed and how much light is allowed. However, the problem with the St. Petersburg Observatory is that the city is growing every single year, and they're now planning to move this observatory to Siberia, which is very sad because so we have to think globally, not only to protect the observatory, there should be a bigger law. Then we have public procurements when minimum lighting emissions for the future projects are in place. But the problem with public procurements, let's take, for example, European green public procurement criteria. I think they amended the green public procurement criteria and introduced some light pollution norms. So if the future construction project would be next to nature area, they should be basically minimum amount of illumination as possible, or in some cases it's not allowed at all. And then in other zones there are also certain limitations. The problem with this criteria, it's volunteer criteria, so it's not really necessary to follow it. And then we can find dark sky protection legislation in protection of indigenous communities when dark sky zones are created to allow traditional activities. Here we can talk about New Zealand or Australia. Then we can talk about cultural heritage when dark sky is considered as the common heritage of humankind. However, it's important to keep in mind that UNESCO some years ago indicated that the dark sky by itself and celestial objects cannot be protected under the UNESCO Convention. So when we talk about the cultural heritage, we should maybe more thinking about the national legislation. Then another field where we can find these norms is space sustainability, when dark skies are protected for the future of space exploration, which I was mentioning earlier, but it's more like not at the legislation level, it's more like at the policy discussion level, but I'm happy that it's there. And the last but not the least important is that we have dark sky protection and light pollution laws. So the law or a policy which adopted specifically to address the increased illumination. And in these laws, we can see that various aspects, various impacts of light pollution are addressed. I will give you some examples later. So here we're going to the exciting part of my presentation based on my classification. I will go through some examples which I found interesting and which highlights the development of the regulations in this field. So uh, the first instrument I want to talk about is conservation of population of European bats. There is an international agreement, Eurobats. It's the agreement between European states and beyond just to protect European bats. Within this agreement is a part of conventional migratory species and a part of United Nations Environmental Programme. Within this framework, they have adopted a resolution, guidelines how to protect pets from light pollution. So that act is a policy document, which is not binding, which is soft law, because here we're talking about guidelines at the international level, and is focusing on environmental protection. So I mentioned earlier, Resolution 8.6, Bats and Light Pollution, was adopted in 2018. And by adoption of this resolution, Eurobats acknowledged the value of natural light and recommended several measures. Basically, they recommended environmental impact assessment of the future project with regard to the protection of bats. So they proposed four-step process. First, to avoid impacts through careful assessment and planning, then to mitigate, to minimize the impacts, then to compensate, to offset the effects of impacts, and to evaluate the effectiveness of mitigation and compensation. If you want to get more familiar with this, I recommend you to read my article. I've written an article about how United Nations Environmental Programme reacts on light pollution. The interesting part of this guidelines and resolution is that it's not only for the parties of the Eurobats, but also for range states. A range state is a term which is used by conventional migratory species, and these are the states where bats are migrating through. So the state is not necessarily a party for the agreement, but it's still a range state in the sense that bats are flying through there. The problem of this guidelines is obviously non-binding character, and that it's specifically focusing on bats. And we all know that there are other species which are also affected by artificial light at night. My next example will be also from the international level. It's International Declaration in Defense of the Night Sky and the Right to Starlight, with a very beautiful name, in my opinion. Or Easy Starlight Declaration. It's a policy document. It's non-binding, also soft law. It's adopted at the international level, and it's focusing specifically on the protection dark sky. So this declaration was adopted at the International Conference in Defense of the Night Sky and the Right to Observe the Stars, which was held in La Palma in Spain in April 2007. First, before I will go to the content of the declaration, I want to highlight that La Palma is basically the center of world observations. They have the biggest telescope in the world, and they even have the Spanish law, to protect the sky above Canary Islands to provide to perform the astronomical activities and also enjoy the dark sky. So this is why it was adopted there. Also, another interesting part of the declaration that it was adopted by the several representatives from the different organizations, including UNESCO and some United Nations Environmental Programme members, and also representatives from the different states. But again, it's a declaration; it's not binding. So this declaration highlights the significance of the dark skies for historical and scientific development. Here we can see like the point of view of, let's say, La Palma. Dark skies is the common and universal heritage of humankind and an integral part of the environment essential for its proper functioning. They indicate that the rights to unpolluted sky should be considered as a valuable right of humankind. They recommend incorporation of light control measures within the environmental protection framework, and they also see tourism as a major instrument for protection of dark skies. After this La Palma conference, after adoption, Starlight Declaration, Starlight Foundation was created. It's still existing non-government organization. So the main point is advocacy for the protection of dark and quiet skies, and also they designate dark sky tourism areas. So they're really going with the tourism as a potential for development. Now I would like to talk about the European Union framework because I think it's pretty big and it always should be addressed. Well, basically, very shortly, there is no any regulations on light pollution at the level of the European Union. However, European Union is working towards this direction. They started to indicate light pollution in some policy documents, and they created some funding projects to consolidate the knowledge on how light pollution impacts human health and the environment and other impacts. So I believe that the next step would be adoption of policy and changing the legislation or adoption of the legislation in this regard. But here I would like to talk about how the existing laws can be already used to address light pollution, basically without any necessary amendments, because light pollution is perfectly fits what is already there. I want to come back to Natura 2000 legal regime, which is created by Habitats Directive and Bird Directive. And Natura 2000 regime seeks to provide adequate conservation for ecosystems and biodiversity by inter alia avoiding deterioration of habitats and disturbance of species. As we all know, artificial light at night is proven as disturbance of species. This is a PDF version, but I have like two two pages of cases, but that's okay. So basically, this was proven by European Court of Justice. In 2016, there was a case between European Commission and Helletic Republic, which is Greece, and Greece was found guilty for non-compliance with Habitats Directive due to fact that they didn't protect sea turtles and they didn't reduce light pollution on the shore side. So we're coming back. I told you to remember the impacts on the sea turtles. Here, how it really works in a real case. And now, if you go to Greece, on the shore side, you can see that the light is either way completely switched off or directed to another side. So this is how the habitats in the bird directive can already work in practice without any specific amendments with regard to light. Another important step at the European Union level was the International Light Pollution Workshop in Brno, in Czech Republic. As a result of this workshop, there was Brno Appeal. Basically, it's a policy brief, so it's a policy instrument which is non-binding soft law at the EU level and focusing on light pollution mitigation. A little bit of a background. 2022, Czech Republic was a president at the European Union Council, and the Ministry of the Environment chose light pollution as one of the major environmental concern, and they started to perform pretty broad action towards light pollution mitigation in Czech Republic, but also they brought it at the European Union level. So the workshop was in November, and as a result of the workshop, Brno Appeal was adopted, which encouraged the European Commission to facilitate changes and include light pollution in the different existing policies like Zero Pollution Action Plan or European Green Deal, and also to include light pollution in the European environmental legislation. It's interesting that this step, now there is a Spanish presidency of the European Council, and Spain is also planning to address light pollution issues towards the European Commission. So I believe we're moving towards the adoption of the legislation at the EU level. Now I'm moving to the national example. So I went from the international to the European Union to the national level. I will give you some, in my opinion, the biggest examples of good legislation to address light pollution. The first one is Federal Nature Conservation Act. It's a German main environmental protection act. It's a legal instrument. It's binding, adopted at the national level, and focusing on environmental protection. In 2021, this General Environmental Act was amended by Insect Protection Act, and a lot of measures with regard to ALAN mitigation were introduced. So ALAN was recognized as a major driver of insect decline. They imposed general ban on new street lighting and eliminated advertising system and nature reserves and some other areas. They banned insect traps using artificial light sources. They imposed an obligation to install new outdoor ALAN with environmentally friendly lighting bulbs. So this was what was in law. And then what is environmentally friendly lighting bulb? So this required certain clarification and further explanation by Ministry of the Environment were adopted also in 2021 in a couple of months. And insect-friendly or environmentally friendly lighting, what is defined by the law, is when we have lighting when it's necessary. So it's time-limited use with maximum of 3,000 candela, without the need to use ultraviolet. Light should be only directed downwards, excluding downwards to the uh, surface of water, because again, we should minimize the impacts of the marine environment as well. And light should be shielded. Another important aspect of German legislation is that Germany became the first European country which adopted on-demand approach to warning lights for wind energy turbines and made aircraft detection lighting systems compulsory for all wind farms, both onshore and offshore. Here I want to give you some clarification. Wind energy farms, they have to have artificial illumination for aircraft safety. And depending on the size of the wind farm or also on the height of the wind farm, we have to have different type of lighting. It's either way a red blinking light or steady red light or blinking white or blue spectrum of light. The interesting part of it is that this illumination is actually very dangerous for the environment. So it introduces, again, significant impact on the environment. For example, birds, and create mortality cases of birds as well. But it's also harmful for human health. There's a recognized wind energy turbine disease, actually, and there is one court case example. It was on the border between France and Belgium, and one couple sued a wind energy farm operator for having wind energy turbine syndrome. And one of the argument and the reasoning why they have these issues was because of the blinking lights. So Germany is really ahead on responding of the issues. And if you're interested on other regulations with regard to lighting and wind energy turbines and this case, you can also read my article. I'm advertising a little bit here. I'm very sorry, but I have all my time to do that. Okay, the next example, which is pretty recent, is Act on Protection Against Light Pollution, which was adopted in Croatia. It's a legal instrument, it's binding, adopted at the national level, and also focusing solely on light pollution mitigation. So measures are introduced to address all forms of light pollution to protect the environment and human health. They aiming to develop new lighting plans and action plan for reconstruction of the present lighting and outdoor illumination. They have measures on prevent excessive lighting emissions. And they also have that lighting should be directed downwards. And they also have lighting monitoring measures, which are the most important part, because how we can assess that light pollution levels are decreasing without any monitoring or measurements, right? We cannot say that something has changed. And this was the main problem with implementation of other laws, for example. The more detailed provisions were adopted by three following ordinances, which the last ones were adopted this year in 2023. So three ordinances in Croatia is about lighting zones, then on measurement and monitoring, and also on content of lighting plan. I will give you just small example on the ordinance of lighting zones. So yeah, they determine lighting zones per like local areas. Only environmentally friendly lamps can be used, but environmentally friendly lighting is lighting which is in accordance to the law, which I mentioned earlier, and with the maximum correlated color temperature up to 3000 Kelvin, which is also still pretty high for some species, by the way. The next national example I have is France, National Commitment to the Environment. It's a general environmental law, but they also have decree on light pollution. So it's both legal instrument, they're binding at the national level and focusing on environmental protection and light pollution at the same time. So this environmental commitment is a general environmental law of France. They indicate that all emissions should be reduced to prevent disturbance of people and the environment, as well as limit the energy consumption. So it's pretty broad. And then the specific norms are indicated in the degree of light pollution. I just gave you some examples here. They adopt several measures like curfews, upward light ratio, like they minimize it, prohibition of light trespass, and they also impose penalty or administrative sanction, which I think was one of the most important measures to have, because we can have all these light pollution measures, but if you don't have monitoring and sanctions, how are we gonna enforce this legislation? So these lighting regulations will become mandatory by 2025. And then the last but not the least important example, in my opinion, is local level. So it's outdoor lighting ordinance from 2022. I'm sorry in advance for pronouncing the name of the city wrong, but I only appreciate this ordinance, so no problem, I hope. City of Presidio, Texas, United States. It's legal instruments. It's binding, adopted at the local level, and focusing on lighting regulations, but it has an aspect of light pollution mitigation specifically. So this ordinance focusing on the several measures, all spotlights and floodlights should point straight down, illuminate only the areas which intended to be lit, so it's a purposeful lighting only. All outdoor islands should be fully shielded except government street lights, which is a big problem though, because light pollution levels are actually increasing mainly because of the public lighting. Then light trespass is also prohibited, like we have seen in the previous examples as well. Luminaries should not exceed to 2700 kelvins, and then they have the distinction between residential property and non-residential property. For residential property, it should not exceed 25,000 lumens per net acre, and for non-residential, not exceed 50,000 lumens. And this ordinance, which why I like it, it also has responsibility for non-compliance. So if you don't comply with this ordinance, you first can get warning notice, and if you don't do anything with your lighting, you get fined $25 per day. So I gave you all this very broad perception of light pollution and regulations, but I would like you also to think that you can also contribute to light pollution mitigation, even without the legislation in your country. I would like to introduce, to get you acquainted with five responsible lighting principles, which were adopted by Illuminating Engineering Society in Dark Sky International, former International Dark Sky Association. Here are the five principles which you can use from today. If you have a garden, you can change already your lighting if you really need it. So the light should be useful. Um, so we have to use the light only when it's needed. The light should be targeted, so the light should be directed only downwards. We have to use as low light levels as possible. We should introduce lighting should be controlled if possible, and then we have to use warmer uh, colors of lighting instead of white blue like we normally do, like in hospital lighting. So I'm going to the last part of my presentation. I would like to say some conclusions and recommendations which I found important. So the current regulatory framework for light pollution mitigation is very diverse and complex. It's mainly focused on energy efficiency rather than on other environmental impacts. We have a gigantic problem with implementation, again, because we don't have measurements, we don't have monitoring, or we have it mentioned, but it's not defined because there's so many different ways how to measure lighting. And I, as a lawyer, shouldn't even talk about it with lighting engineers. And we also don't have penalty or sanctions. And the competence is also not clarified in the legislation, which also creates big problems. Who actually should check whether there is a compliance with the existing legislation? So, what can be the solutions, in my opinion? We should introduce more binding regulations at all the levels, from international to local level. I consider the possibility of working with down top and top down approaches because I believe that even a small action at the local level can lead to adoption of the national legislation. And if you have more and more states adopting national legislation, it can lead to adoption of the at the international level and another way around. Also, the regulation of this subject, this problem, should be based on cooperation and joint action. I'm here talking about different states, but also different actors from the various fields like lighting industry, lawyers, policymakers, lighting designers, and so on. Light pollution should be legally recognized as an environmental problem and be included in environmental protection framework. But this is my main point. I'm writing a dissertation about it. We should address all Allen impacts. Again, not only focusing on energy efficiency, we should also consider other impacts as well. We have to have incentives, but also sanctions for non-compliance with the dark sky protection legislation. We have to have more awareness raising campaigns. And again, I'm very thankful uh, for Philip for this opportunity to raise awareness about light pollution issue and talk about the problems with the legislation we have. And light should be a part of environmental impact assessment and monitoring. Again, it will lead to, for in my opinion, for the better implementation of existing laws. And my final message would be stop spreading the lights, start caring about the night. And thank you for your attention. Let's stay in touch. Feel free to scan the QR code. There is my LinkedIn. But I welcome your questions. Thank you for your attention again.